And welcome back to Capital Tonight. So last week, the American Tort Reform Foundation released its annual Judicial Hellholes report. Yes, hellholes. Each year, the organization lists the top 10 court systems in the U.S. that it deems most in need of cost controls. And this year, New York City and Albany together came in at number 6. The foundation argues that lawmakers are too beholden to the trial lawyer lobby to enact real reform. And another problem, a fair number of legislators are actually also lawyers, and they personally benefit from the status quo. So, joining me tonight to talk more about this is Tom Stebbins. He is from the Lawsuit Reform Alliance of New York and president of the Associated General Contractors of New York, Mike Elmendorf. You are familiar with him, and you are the vice chair of this organization as well. Okay.
Yes.
So I think we should start off very basically. Please, what is tort reform?
Well, tort reform is a way that we can balance our civil justice system to really enact justice for both parties. Because right now, there are a number of situations, a number of issues that present themselves in the court that are really unbalanced and unreasonable. For example, if somebody were to break into your house and get injured, they could then sue you for the injuries that they incurred while breaking into your house. Most other states have solved that legislatively, but New York hasn't.
We actually saw a political example of this, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
Yeah, a senator. But it turned out he was trespassing and he was going to sue because he was injured, then he decided not to. It was a very big problem. However, it speaks to this particular issue, right?
Absolutely. It highlighted the problem that we have, just one of the many problems that we have in the state of New York.
Okay, so I understand from a business perspective why this would be bad, for example, your members,
Sure.
the contractors, because it drives up costs. I know there's a certain cost of doing business that you expect that you're going to have to pay out a certain amount. But to limit a person's, for example, in capping, what they can receive if they sue you in damages or lawyers' fees, et cetera, seems unfair. That's not what our court system's all about.
Well, yeah, but it's about having balance, like Tom said. And, you know, this is what's interesting about our coalition is it's essentially everybody except the trial lawyers. We have farmers, small businesses, large businesses, contractors. Well,
you're surprised,
everybody.
Mike, that you want to limit what they can make. They make money based on what they get.
That's not really what it's about. It's also about looking at the costs writ large of the tort system in New York. Directorship Magazine looked at the factors that companies, you don't read that routinely?
A very widely read
publication.
I'm sorry.
But an important fact, though, they looked at the factors that larger companies use in terms of site selection. And number one was a qualified workforce, which makes sense. And you'd think number two would be taxes or the regulatory environment, but it wasn't. It was actually the legal environment, the tort environment, because you can look at the tax system or the regulatory climate in the state, and you can quantify it. You can say, here's what it's going to cost me to do business in New York. And the taxes may be high, and there may be some bad regulation, but you can crunch the numbers and figure out if it makes sense. The liability climate is a total roll of the dice. If you have a big judgment, you're sunk.
But two things. Isn't that why you have insurance?
But you still pay for it. Because if your liability exposure is so much larger, look at Labor Law 240, the scaffold law, which is absolute liability for any gravity-related injury on a work site, which is a huge problem for the construction industry. You have no ability to defend yourself. It doesn't matter if a person was drinking, if the person was not following safety standards, if the person was disobeying a direct order from a supervisor, 100% liability. So think about, yes, you have insurance, but think about what it costs you to get insurance when you have that kind of exposure. So and those costs just get passed on to everybody else.
And let me give you an example, too. I mean, you mentioned insurance, and sure, everyone has insurance, but sometimes these judgments exceed insurance. And Mike mentioned that we have doctors, we have businesses, those kinds of groups involved in our organization, but municipalities are also hugely affected by these issues. And there's a case in Amherst, New York, out in western New York right now, where they were sued for $23 million under the scaffold law. It was reduced to $13.6 million on appeal, but they only had $10 million of insurance. So now there's a $3 million shortfall that they can't necessarily afford, and that's going to come right out of the general fund.
Okay. Was it a jury trial?
It what? Well, there is no trial. That's the problem with the scaffold law.
You don't have
there's no trial.
But I guess just putting that aside for a second, though, I mean, you're basically, I mean, the way our system works is you go on trial and a jury of your peers makes a decision about what it is that you are in fact entitled to, right? So, well, that's the way we've always done it.
But that doesn't exist in the state of New York. The scaffold law is...
For the scaffold law, I understand that. Okay, so let's assume, is that the most egregious example of what makes New York a judicial hellhole?
Well, we talked about trespasser already. We talked about scaffold, but there's also issues, for example, like expert witness. Right now, an expert witness doesn't need a certificate of merit to say that they're an expert in the actual field that they're testifying as an expert.
Yeah, but if I'm an attorney worth my salt and you put up some expert, then I'm going to poke holes in that person's resume. I mean, that's my job, right?
Absolutely, but to get that case out of the system to begin with, we should have some kind of certificate of merit, because right now we have all these frivolous cases coming through the system that cost everybody money. And that also slows down the process of justice. So if we clog up our system with these bad experts, that really slows down justice for everyone.
And everybody loses.
Okay,
Right.
but maybe the real problem here is that our society is just too litigious and you're never going to do anything about that.
Well, we are a litigious society, and maybe we're a little more litigious state than some other states, but it's about having balance and fairness.
Wait,
in
what's
our
number
laws.
one again? Philadelphia.
Philadelphia.
All right, so what's so bad about Philadelphia that we're doing better than them?
Well, people actually import cases to Philadelphia to try them there. Generally, the judges and the juries there are very, very friendly towards the plaintiffs. And so I think that's part of the reason that Philadelphia is high on the list. But Pennsylvania just beat us last year in a particular tort reform. There's an issue called joint and several liability, where a person who is found 1% guilty can pay 100% of the judgment. Now, Pennsylvania passed a law that says if you're 15% guilty, you pay 15% of the judgment. It's called fair share liability, and it makes sense. In the state of New York, if you're found 1%, you can pay 100%. And that's why municipalities get roped into these lawsuits all the time, because they target the municipalities. They include everybody. They sue everybody, because if they can find that modicum of liability, they can pay 100%.
Does this pressure make entities more likely to settle out of court, do you believe? That every time a lawsuit comes up, that you sue the city because you slipped on their sidewalk, or you sue the mall because you fell down the stairs, or whatever it is, it makes the pressure on this, because in fact they're more likely, if they go to court, to get a bad outcome, the businesses just say forget it and settle.
Oh yeah, I think people have a sense that the system is stacked in favor of plaintiffs, and so you have to look at it in its totality and say, what's my best way out of this? And so people do settle. And you look at the cost for local governments, it was what the New York City Corporation Council said recently, that they already paid out like $500 million
just this year.
Just this year so far. And so it's a huge cost, not only on my industry, not only on businesses, but on taxpayers. Because like the example that Tom offered, that's a hit to property taxpayers. It's a cost for school districts who do construction. It's a cost for everybody that has health insurance. I mean, this year, Governor Cuomo, to his credit, advanced some pretty significant medical malpractice reform. It was resoundingly rejected by the legislature.
No, but a piece of it actually ended up coming through, which is a brain damaged baby fund, right? And it's basically capping the payout. And we talked about this a little bit before we got started. And it's so difficult to put a cap on someone's tragedy. I mean, you're basically saying to a person, you're not entitled to more than X, where it could cost you X times 20 or 200 to take care of this person for the rest of their life.
There's no question that that's a very emotionally charged issue, but the flip side of it is, in the absence of reform, you have counties in New York State where, unbelievably, you don't even have an OBGYN practicing. People can't get care. People don't have access to health insurance because health insurance premiums are that much higher in New York because of our flawed civil justice system. I mean, that's the real issue here. Those are the folks who are really losing.
And consider the cap very similar to the property tax cap, where it's kind of a blunt instrument to enact in reforms after the fact. So if you cap this, you can start to have things like what the Bronx has done and what Buffalo has done, where they have judge-directed negotiation, where a judge is deciding, okay, I have a case here that's very similar to a case here. Let's have the same outcome rather than variable outcomes in the two different things. That's not a fair system. And so we right now have these test cases in the Bronx and in Buffalo where a judge is part of the negotiations, not just a jury, and that judge is part of the medical process and is engaged in it.
Well, not fair for you guys as the defendants, perhaps, but fair. The plaintiffs, I'm sure, think it's plenty fair if they get $1 million compared to somebody else who gets $500,000.
Well, what about the person who gets $500,000 though?
That's the luck of the draw. That's how our judicial system works, isn't it?
Right, but if we get a judge there who's versed in the issues, who can equalize it and say, let's say $750 for each, and make that uniform across the board, everyone's treated the same way, which I think is a big part of our judicial system.
Okay, so I assume that this, again, it's going to be tort reform. We talk about it every year in the state legislature. I'm sure we're going to be talking about it again.
We hope so.
I'm sure you. I'm sure you do. I want to thank you very much for your time, Mike Elmendorf.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom Stebbins. Thanks very much for being here. I
Thanks
appreciate
for having
it.
me.
So we're just